You've just spent weeks building 11 miles of siege walls around an enemy fortress, starving them into submission. Victory is close. Then, one morning, you look outward, away from the fortress, and see a second army arriving. Not thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands. You are no longer the besieger, you are the besieged, trapped between two enemy forces at once, with nowhere left to retreat. This actually happened in late September of 52 BCE, outside a hilltop stronghold called Alesia, in what is now eastern France. Julius Caesar's legions found themselves sandwiched between a Gallic army inside the walls and a Gallic relief force outside them, one of the tightest tactical corners any commander in ancient history ever fought his way out of. For 7 years, Caesar had been carving Gaul into Roman territory, tribe by tribe, region by region, through a mixture of decisive battles, negotiated alliances, and outright brutality. It was slow, methodical conquest, and by 52 BCE it looked nearly complete, with most major Gallic tribes either subdued or nominally allied with Rome. Then a young Arverni nobleman named Vercingetorix did something no Gallic leader had managed before him. He united dozens of rival, often historically hostile tribes into a single coordinated resistance against Roman occupation. Vercingetorix understood early on that his warriors couldn't beat disciplined Roman legions in a straightforward open battle, so he adopted a scorched earth approach instead, burning Gallic towns, farms and supply stores before Caesar's army could reach and use them, deliberately denying the Romans food, shelter and forage as they advanced deeper into the countryside. It was a painful strategy for his own people to endure, but it worked well enough to hand Caesar a rare, humiliating defeat that same year at the town of Gergovia, where Roman losses were severe and Caesar himself was forced into an uncharacteristic retreat. But Vercingetorix eventually made a decision that would define the rest of the campaign. Rather than continue harassing the Romans across open country, where mobility favoured the Gauls, he withdrew his forces, roughly 80,000 fighters by most estimates, into the naturally fortified hilltop settlement of Alesia, believing its steep terrain and defensible position would hold while reinforcements gathered elsewhere across Gaul. Caesar saw an opportunity buried inside that decision. If Vercingetorix's entire army could be sealed inside Alesia and systematically cut off from food, the whole Gallic rebellion might collapse along with him, ending the war in a single decisive stroke, rather than years of continued fighting. So Caesar's legions, roughly 50,000 to 60,000 men, including auxiliary cavalry and support troops, moved swiftly to encircle the fortress completely and begin construction of the most ambitious siege works the Roman army had ever attempted in the field. By 52 BCE, Julius Caesar was no longer a young, unproven officer chasing political relevance. He was a battle-hardened commander who had spent the better part of a decade in Gaul, and that experience shaped how he approached problems most generals would have found unsolvable. Years earlier, long before his Gallic campaigns even began, a young Caesar had been captured by Mediterranean pirates while crossing the Aegean Sea, held for ransom for several weeks. Rather than panic or plead for leniency, he reportedly spent his captivity treating the pirates as something closer to an amused audience, joking with them that, once released, he would hunt them all down and have them crucified. They laughed it off as the empty bravado of a young captive. He wasn't joking. Upon securing his release and payment of ransom, Caesar raised a small private fleet almost immediately, tracked the same pirates down along the coast, and carried out exactly what he'd promised, down to the letter. It's a story that reveals something essential about how Caesar consistently operated under pressure, an almost eerie personal calm in dangerous situations, paired with an absolute refusal to accept a bad outcome as permanent or final. That same temperament defined his command style throughout the Gallic campaigns. Where many Roman generals of his era relied heavily on rigid, textbook formations and predictable tactics passed down through generations, Caesar consistently improvised under pressure instead. reshaping his strategy mid-battle rather than stubbornly sticking to a plan that circumstances had already rendered obsolete. At Alesia, that adaptability wouldn't just be useful, it would become the single deciding factor standing between his army and total annihilation. Because no Roman siege manual had ever seriously accounted for the possibility of besieging an enemy fortress while simultaneously being besieged yourself, from the outside, by an even larger force. Caesar's engineers didn't build one wall around Alesia. They built two, facing in opposite directions, forming a ring within a ring. The inner fortification, called the Contravallation, faced toward Alesia itself, trapping Vercingetorix's army inside the fortress and cutting off any food or supplies from reaching them. Roughly 10 miles of ditches, ramparts, watchtowers and sharpened obstacles surrounded the hill entirely, designed to make both escape and resupply effectively impossible. But Caesar suspected something else was coming. Before the Roman lines had fully closed, Vercingetorix had sent his cavalry racing out through gaps in the encirclement, carrying an urgent call for every allied Gallic tribe to send warriors to break the siege from the outside. Caesar knew that message had gotten through, and he built accordingly. So his engineers constructed a second wall, the Circumvallation, facing outward this time, roughly 13 miles in length, essentially mirroring the first ring, but pointed in the opposite direction. Between the two walls sat Caesar's own army, occupying a defensive corridor that could, in theory, face threats from either side simultaneously. Picture a medieval castle that builds not just walls to keep invaders out, but a second, identical wall facing inward as well, because the defenders know a second enemy is going to appear behind them before the fight is even over. That's essentially what Caesar's legions built by hand, under constant threat, in a matter of weeks. The Romans reinforced these lines with brutal, low-tech ingenuity. Rows of sharpened stakes hidden in camouflaged pits, nicknamed lilies by the soldiers, angled spikes buried just beneath the surface, designed to cripple cavalry and infantry alike, and networks of interlocking trenches meant to slow any assault long enough for defenders to respond. Caesar communicated the stakes of the situation plainly to his officers and centurions. Hold both walls, no matter which direction the attack came from, because losing either side meant losing everything. According to Caesar's own written account, the relief force that eventually arrived numbered some 250,000 infantry, alongside thousands of cavalry, assembled from dozens of Gallic tribes across the region. Modern historians generally view that figure as inflated, likely for political effect back in Rome, and believe the real number was considerably smaller. Even by the most conservative modern estimates, though, the combined Gallic forces, trapped garrison plus relief army, still vastly outnumbered Caesar's roughly 50,000 to 60,000 legionaries, possibly by a factor of several times over. The relief army arrived first as a rumour passed between Roman sentries, then as a cloud of dust rising along the horizon, then finally as an undeniable, sprawling mass of warriors, wagons, and livestock stretching across the countryside beyond the outer wall, far larger than anything the legions manning that section had prepared themselves to face. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's own men, watching from the fortress heights with a clear view of the approaching host, understood immediately what this meant. Reinforcement had finally arrived, weeks after their cavalry had first ridden out to raise the alarm across Gaul. Now the two Gallic forces simply needed to coordinate an attack from both directions at once, crushing the thin Roman line caught between them, the way a blacksmith closes a set of tongs around molten iron. The first major assault came against the outer wall, the Circumvallation, as the relief force tested Roman defences under cover of darkness, probing methodically for weak points along 13 miles of fortification, manned by legionaries who had already spent weeks building it under constant threat and exhausting physical labour. Roman sentries spotted the movement almost immediately. Alarms spread down the line in the dark. Legionaries scrambled into defensive positions without full clarity on exactly where the main thrust would eventually land, straining to see through torchlight and shadow. At the same time, from inside the fortress, Vercingetorix's warriors surged toward the inner wall, hurling improvised ladders, hooks, and makeshift siege equipment against Roman fortifications, desperately trying to force a breach before Caesar's men could fully commit their attention and reserves to the opposite side of the encirclement. For the Romans holding that narrow strip of ground between the two walls, this was the exact nightmare scenario their commanders had feared since construction began. Fighting in both directions simultaneously, unable to fully reinforce either front without dangerously weakening the other at the precise moment it might be needed most. The initial assault failed to break through on either side, but it was only the opening move in what would become a running, multi-day struggle. Gallic commanders regrouped overnight, studied the Roman defences more carefully in daylight, and identified a genuine weak point. A section of wall near a hill called Mont Réa, where difficult terrain had made full fortification more challenging for Roman engineers, leaving that stretch of line noticeably thinner than the rest. Days later, the Gauls struck there in overwhelming force, attacking from both inside and outside the encirclement at once, deliberately timed to overwhelm Roman defenders before reserves could be redirected in time to help. 60,000 Gallic warriors, according to Caesar's own account, moved against this single vulnerable stretch of wall, supported by a coordinated push from Vercingetorix's own trapped forces against the inner ring at almost the identical moment. Roman defences at Mont Réa began to visibly buckle under the sustained pressure of the assault. Caesar, watching the situation unfold from an elevated command position where he could observe multiple points along both walls at once, recognized immediately that this single weak point could unravel the entire 11-week siege if it wasn't reinforced without delay, and reinforced decisively. He gathered a strong contingent of cavalry personally, and led them himself into the fighting, riding directly toward the breach, rather than issuing orders safely from a distance behind the lines. His scarlet commander's cloak, worn deliberately visible above the chaos, became an immediate rallying point for wavering troops who could suddenly see exactly where their general had chosen to stand and fight alongside them. The cavalry charge struck the Gallic force from an unexpected angle, catching warriors who were already engaged and physically exhausted from hours of continuous fighting along the wall. Simultaneously, Roman infantry reserves pushed forward from the opposite side to stabilize the breach at Mont Réa, closing gaps in the line that had come dangerously close to giving way entirely. Panic, once it began spreading through the Gallic relief force, moved with frightening speed. Warriors who watched neighbouring units breaking and falling back began retreating themselves, uncertain whether the entire battle was already lost or simply shifting direction. Retreat quickly turned into disorder. Disorder turned into an outright rout that Roman cavalry pursued relentlessly across the open ground beyond the wall, cutting down fleeing warriors who had lost all cohesion as an organised fighting force. Vercingetorix, watching this collapse unfold from inside Alesia with no way to intervene directly, understood at once that the relief effort had failed completely. His own assault against the inner wall lost momentum almost immediately as word spread among his warriors that the relief army outside was scattering rather than advancing to their aid. Without reinforcement, without fresh supplies reaching the starving fortress, and now, without any realistic hope of breaking the siege from either direction, his position had become entirely unsalvageable. The following day, Vercingetorix made his decision. According to the historian Plutarch, he rode out from Alesia in his finest armour, circled Caesar's position, then dismounted, laid down his weapons at Caesar's feet, and surrendered in silence. Roman losses at Alesia were relatively modest given the scale of the fighting. Gallic losses, both among Vercingetorix's trapped garrison and the shattered relief force, were severe. Precise numbers are uncertain, but ancient accounts describe the surrounding countryside littered with abandoned weapons and equipment from the collapsed relief army. Alesia effectively ended organized Gallic resistance to Roman rule. Without a unifying leader or coordinated army left standing, remaining pockets of resistance across Gaul collapsed over the following months, and the region was absorbed permanently into the expanding Roman world. Vercingetorix himself was held prisoner for nearly 6 years, then paraded through Rome during Caesar's official triumph in 46 BCE, before being executed by strangulation, the customary Roman fate for defeated enemy commanders displayed in such ceremonies. For Caesar personally, Alesia became the crowning achievement of his Gallic campaigns, cementing both his military reputation and the enormous wealth and loyalty of veteran legions that would soon prove decisive in an entirely different kind of conflict: the Roman civil war against Pompey and the Senate that erupted just a few years later. Without the resources, prestige, and battle-tested army he built conquering Gaul, culminating at Alesia, Caesar's later march on Rome itself might never have been possible. Militarily, Alesia remains one of history's most studied examples of simultaneous offensive and defensive siege warfare, a case still examined today for its combination of engineering discipline, adaptable field leadership, and the sheer logistical achievement of building and holding 2 complete fortification systems facing opposite directions under active enemy pressure from both sides at once. Few commanders in recorded history have ever solved the exact problem Caesar faced at Alesia. Fewer still have solved it while personally leading the decisive counterattack themselves, on horseback, at the precise moment their entire campaign hung in the balance. Caesar didn't just win a siege at Alesia. He solved a problem that shouldn't have had a solution, trapped between 2 armies, and he turned that trap into the very reason he won. If your own defences were suddenly attacked from both directions at once, would you split your forces evenly, or gamble everything on reinforcing one side first, the way Caesar did? Tell me your answer in the comments, and if this kind of ancient military engineering fascinates you as much as it does me, subscribe for more sieges, campaigns, and commanders who found a way out of situations that looked completely unwinnable.